In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the impact of globalization, specifically on the concept of global poverty. To what extent has globalization, specifically political and economic globalization, had a positive or a negative effect on the state of global poverty? Now, we've examined the nature of globalization as its impact on the nation state, as well as the impacts of economic and political globalization more broadly. And like I said, this lesson is going to focus on the impact of globalization on global poverty. But we're also going to be, in the next few lessons, exploring the impact on other geopolitical issues. So, for example, we're going to talk about in this lesson global poverty. We're also going to talk about the impact of globalization on the perpetuation or the upholding of international human rights, on human rights internationally and globally, as well as the impact that it's had on armed conflict, and then finally, the environmental impact of globalization, specifically economic globalization, and to an extent the extent to which political globalization has been able to allow us as an international community to be able to try and deal with the problems that are caused by the growing issues of climate change. So, focusing on global poverty in this lesson, let's begin by asking a few questions. And the question that we essentially need to answer is the extent to which globalization can or does reduce or resolve the problem of global poverty. So the first question is, does globalization reduce global poverty? Or even if not, is it possible that it even could? Is it possible that this is even a mechanism that is able to have an impact on global poverty? On the one hand, globalization could provide very interesting benefits to the reduction of global poverty. So, generally speaking, when we have access to economic markets, something that is caused by an increase in economic globalization, we tend to see greater prosperity from an economic perspective. So, for example, the value of world trade between 2005 and 2013 went from around 8 trillion to 18.8 trillion. And don't forget, in that time between 2005 and 2013, we also had a global financial crisis and global recession in 2008. So even despite that, we still see a massive increase in the amount of world trade that takes place between 2005 and 2013. And this is something that only is ever going to increase as the years go on. The benefits of this include economic developments in developing countries. So if we are allowing more and more developing countries that are not necessarily economically that prosperous yet, if we allow them to have greater access to a greater integrated world market system, then we are going to see more and more prosperity and more flow of capital into these regions. That is generally the overall ideas behind the basic economics of economic globalization. So, for example, countries like China and India have seen increased economic prosperity to the extent to which that to even label these countries as developing countries anymore would be something that is in some instances quite debatable, at least when it comes to China. From China's perspective, they have seen a massive growth in economic prosperity as the result of a number of different initiatives, one of them being an opening of the world economy to Chinese markets, to Chinese industry. So, for example, an example of a piece of evidence or a statistic that you can use is that between 2018 and 2019, the country of India was the fastest growing economy, with an increase in growth of 7.3%, which you might not think, oh, that's not a particularly large growth increase, but from a per annum basis for a single economy, that is quite a significant increase in growth. Globalization has also seen benefits directly in developing countries also. So due to the fact that we see a low labor cost when it comes to developing countries, as well as low manufacturing costs, more and more companies are looking to invest in developing countries. Now, the extent to which this is actually a positive thing is one that is debated, since low labor cost and low manufacturing costs tend to be in conjunction with, or tend to be the result of, low labor rights and labor safety. And really an increase in labor safety and labor rights would probably necessarily lead to an increase in labor costs. So there is a bit of a debate to be had about the extent to which we really can be ethically investing in developing countries where there are low labor costs if there is no legal regulation of labor rights in those regions. So there is a back and forth that you can talk about there. But an example of the amount of investment into other countries is that in the year 2020, so during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the majority of the world was in lockdown, and there was a massive cut to supply chains in around the world, the amount of foreign direct investment that was contributed was 850 billion, according to the OECD. Now, foreign direct investment refers to the flow of capital, the flow of money from a home country to a host state. So from one country into another, the flow, the investment into these regions. Now, this is done in a number of different ways. This can be done through the establishment of business operations in certain countries, and therefore necessarily flowing from that will be capital into those regions as well. But foreign direct investment is defined in a number of different ways. And so, since the COVID pandemic is coming to an end, or we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic for now, so long as there's no new variant, we know that this is a number that is expected to increase as the economy begins to increase. And given the fact that the use of foreign direct investment is something that complements global trade flows, where the fact that there is a link, a conjunction, a connection with global investment and global trade, whereby essentially as global trade increases, the flow of capital and investment into regions also increases as a result of that. We will see that as trade increases, as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we will also see that foreign direct investment will increase as well as a result of that. And that's something that we generally see whenever we see an increase in global trade. So those are examples of ideas that we can really present to suggest that global poverty is actually something that is benefited as the result of globalization and economic globalization. But what are the counter-arguments to this proposition? Well, a general theory that one can apply is that globalization, economic globalization, has led to an increase in a new form of colonialism, a new form of imperialism. This concept is loosely defined as neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, and it posits that the reliance on the global south for raw materials and cheap labor leads to advantages for the global north that aren't necessarily seen in these developing countries. So we are essentially exploiting economically, using economic exploitation in a similar way to where there were empires 100 years ago. And the extent to which that there are empires today in this similar sense, in this sort of neo-colonial example, is something that is debatable. So, as the result of neocolonialism, the global south will not be able to achieve both industrialization as well as economic prosperity in and of themselves in an independent manner, since they are reliant on the manufacturing, or they are reliant on the demand from the global north, from the western states, from the countries like the United States, like China, like countries in Europe. Since there is a heightened amount of demand from those regions, and that they are utilizing the supply when it comes to labor and when it comes to low manufacturing costs as a result of that, we see that the global south may not be able to achieve industrialization and their own economic prosperity themselves. So essentially, where we had economic exploitation over 100 years ago, in where we had empires, where we had the British Empire, where we had German, French, or Russian empires, this has essentially just replaced that. We have just seen a replacement of the actual traditional forms of empire with this new idea of empire, this sort of economic empire, the economic colonialism and imperialism. So with labor demand coming from the global south, there is also a concern, as I mentioned earlier on, that people may be forced to work in harsh conditions where there is no, or there is little to no regulation of employment rights within these regions. So one of the reasons why in certain regions the demand the cost of labor, sorry, is actually so low, is because they are paid slave wages, or they are working in very dangerous conditions, and so they're put into a situation whereby if that situation was in the UK or the United States, those employment conditions, they would be illegal because of the employment law that we have in the UK or in the United States. And so as the result of that, you might argue that there is a certain inherent immorality behind the concept of relying on labor demand from the global south, especially in situations where there are very harsh working conditions, where there are little to no employment rights and regulations at all. So, continuing on then, there is also criticism that can be levied to countries such as China, with increasingly what are known as predatory investment measures. And we've seen this growth continue more and more, especially when it comes to Chinese foreign direct investment in a number of impoverished African states. So there is concepts known as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially we have seen with the Belt and Road Initiative that has been introduced by the state of China, a huge increase in foreign direct investment into the continent of Africa. And this initiative has levied claims of both this sort of neo-colonialism, this neo-imperialism, as well as something known as debt trap diplomacy. Now, what debt trap diplomacy essentially tells us is, according to this theory, a country will export a vast amount of capital investment, like China has to Africa, in a similar kind of way, as a creditor will lend vast amounts of money to a debtor within a sort of company regulation perspective. And in order to do this, the Chinese state then becomes the creditors to this country, to this impoverished country, who are now the debtors, and they do so in order to leverage greater political capital and greater political influence in these regions. Because if you are essentially indebted to a country like China, and China seeks to leverage greater political influence in your state, then this can lead to them essentially taking over a certain amount of the political decisions that can be made. So debt trap diplomacy is something that is increasingly criticized as China is being seen as doing something very similar to that when it comes to African states. So the extent to which that economic globalization and these mass exports of foreign direct investment into other countries is not necessarily seen as something that's having a positive effect on global poverty. So we can really look at a for and against when we talk about the general rules that we can establish for the impact of economic globalization on the extent to which global poverty exists around the world.